In the last chapter, we saw how the issue of slavery had divided both North and South and ultimately culminated into the Civil War. We also saw how changes in technology had produced battlefield casualties that exceeded anyone's wildest imagination, with over 600,000 dead within 4 years of fighting. While most Americans are familiar with this era of their history, few are familiar with what exactly came next after the Civil War. Now, with the North's victory secured over the South, the world's most largest modern slave society has been shattered, forcing many in both the North and South to ask the important question of what would come next. In relation to that question was the question of how do you bring a nation together after a civil war? To answer these questions would require a plan that not only brought the South back into the Union, but tried to define the essence of the nation. Who exactly was a citizen of the U.S.? What rights did these U.S. citizens enjoy? And ultimately, what did it mean to be an American? Join me as we look into a time of great chaos, of great promise, and ultimately of great failure as we delve into what will be a two-part lecture series of Chapter 16, The Reconstruction Era, 1865 to 1877. Now, during the Civil War and afterwards, there wasn't much intersectional hatred. Usually between nations, when there had been wars, there had been great hatreds. I mean, it's pretty self-obvious. People had died, loss of property, there were great hatreds. But here, this really wasn't the case. During the war and after the war, Southerners were really treated pretty fairly. Case in point, the man on the left, Jefferson Davis, who had been the president of the Confederate States of America. Now, after the war, when he was captured by the military, he was held and he was going to be tried for treason and murder. During the war, Northerners themselves had often said they would hang Jeff Davis from a sour apple tree. It was kind of a little song or rhyme, I guess you could say. But by 1867, tempers against Jefferson Davis had actually started to cool, so much so that he was actually turned over to civil authorities, and he was allowed actually to get bail, and he was never actually brought to trial. Eventually, he lives in semi-retirement in Mississippi, and he's actually offered a series of jobs from small colleges throughout the South, one being one in Texas that would later become known as Texas A&M University. Now, during the war, by 1862, there was already a readmission policy in place for when the North saw that eventually they would take over these southern states that had been in rebellion, and they would bring them back into the Union. Now, Lincoln will appoint temporary governors to the South under military control, and by December of 1863, he comes up with his own readmission policy. So what did this look like exactly? Well, all Southerners who had taken up arms had to take an oath of loyalty, swearing that they would never again would fight against the United States of America. The only exception would be those high Confederate officials. Now, when 10% of a state's population that had voted in the presidential election of 1860 had actually taken this, then these states could set up their own state governments. The governments had to be Republican in form, meaning that they elected representatives to represent them. It's not the Republican Party. It's the Republican form of government. They also had to recognize that slavery was over, and they had to provide for black education. But it didn't require that blacks be given the right to vote. This will actually become known as Lincoln's 10% plan. Now, why was Lincoln being so lenient to the South? So many people had died, so much destruction had occurred. What it really reflects is Lincoln's political wisdom against being vindictive. He knows that if he gives the South harsh treatment, it's going to be hard to bring these people back into the United States, and it's only going to stiffen the resolve of those southern states that are still in rebellion. So he wants to offer the South moderate peace terms. For Lincoln, the South hasn't created political suicide by seceding. He sees that the South itself never stopped being part of the United States, that it was just in areas of rebellion. So again, he's trying to extend to the South these very moderate terms and hoping that he can bring the nation back together again. Now, these governments in the South would be puppet governments until the end of the war. And also, Lincoln, like I said, is trying to lay the foundation of allowing the Republican Party inroads into the South and hopefully compete with the Democratic Party in control for the South. Now, not every Republican liked Lincoln's idea. A lot of them say that it's too lenient, the South has to be punished. A group that was really vocal in this would be known as radical Republicans. They were more kind of the left-leaning, reform-minded, very vocal faction of the Republican Party. And by 1864, they've already come up with their own plan known as the Wade-Davis Bill. Now, this was proposed in February of 1864 by Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio and Henry Winter Davis of Maryland. Now, what exactly did this plan say? What it said is that a vast majority of voters in the South and government officials who had taken part in the Confederacy had to take the ironclad oath. What this meant is they had to swear that they had never supported war against the United States and they never supported the Confederacy. Lincoln, looking at this, knows that a vast majority of Southerners won't qualify under this bill, and he also sees that it's only going to delay Reconstruction in the South. So Lincoln pocket vetoes this bill. Even though it had been passed by Congress, Lincoln again sees that ultimately it's going to only make the situation worse, so he vetoes the Wade-Davis bill. Now, as the Civil War winds down, by April 11th, Abraham Lincoln is calling for limited black suffrage. By April the 14th, he holds his last cabinet meeting, unbeknownst to him. Now, in this cabinet meeting, he is urging that his cabinet members also keep an open mind and compassion towards the South. Because, again, he sees that the South was only in rebellion, that it never really broke away from the U.S., that these were Americans as well, and we had to bring them back if we were going to bring this nation back together. Little does he know that that night when he goes to Ford's Theater, there's a vast conspiracy afoot, sat by John Wilkes Booth. As we talked about in the last chapter, John Wilkes Booth would be responsible for assassinating Abraham Lincoln. But what most Americans don't know is there was a larger conspiracy afoot. Booth's ultimate plan was to decapitate the government. He would take out the president. The Secretary of State, William Seward, also was attacked very violently and stabbed. Ulysses S. Grant was going to be also assassinated. However, he was out of town. And Vice President Andrew Johnson would also be assassinated. Johnson at this time was staying in a boarding house, and his assassin was supposed to knock on the door as Johnson opened it up and stab a knife into his heart. However, Johnson's assassin got cold feet and spent the remainder of the evening across the boarding house, from the boarding house, actually getting drunk and never actually committing his part in the assassination plot. With this, Andrew Johnson is going to be sworn in as the 17th president, and this is the first time in U.S. history that a president comes in on the assassination of his predecessor. Now, who exactly is Andrew Johnson, this new guy who's now president? A lot of people were asking this question with the death of the great Abraham Lincoln. Johnson is now faced with restoring the Union. He had actually been born into poverty in North Carolina. His parents were pretty much dirt poor. They were illiterate. Johnson's father died when he's 3 years old, and his mother can't really provide for both Johnson and his brother, and so she sets him up as in apprenticeship, I should actually say, to a tailor in Raleigh, North Carolina. And as you remember, we talked about apprenticeships were basically the only option poor citizens had to get their children any sort of education. It was, in a sense, child indentured servitude. The conditions were so bad for Johnson and his brother that they actually ran away. And there were advertisements in newspapers describing Johnson and trying to get him back, offering cash rewards for both he and his brothers. And it was actually appearing side by side with advertisements regarding runaway slaves. Now, Johnson and his brother will run away to Greenville, North Carolina, where they'll set up their own tailor shops. And here he will meet his future wife, who will teach him how to read and actually how to do mathematical problems. And Johnson finds great success as being a tailor, and ultimately what will happen is he will get into politics. Eventually he will go from being a town alderman to the state legislature, to U.S. Congress, to serving as the governor of Tennessee for over 2 times. And Johnson really, for Johnson, he really sees that the politics is really the only kind of step that he has an option for improving himself up the social ladder, because he had said if he had had more education, he would rather have been a teacher or a chemist. During the Civil War, as a senator from Tennessee, he is the only Democratic senator from the South that remains loyal to the Union. He is a defender of the Union, and he thinks that regardless of how the issue of slavery is felt within the nation, that the United States is supreme. Ultimately, he's very stubborn. He can't handle criticism. He's very thin-skinned. He holds many racist views. He had at once been a slaveholder himself. He hates, I should say, the kind of planter aristocracy, those who kind of lorded it over those who actually had to work for a living. Johnson being a tailor, he had to. He also dislikes having to work with African Americans, and this is going to be reflected in his policies as president after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Now, when Johnson becomes president, he's only been vice president for 6 weeks, and now he's thrust into the office of President of the United States. Those in Congress who now know of Johnson and know of his work feel that they're pretty comfortable that they can work with them. And eventually, in May of 1865, Congress is out for, I guess you could say, summer break in a way, until December of that year. Now, during this time, this is where Johnson really kind of starts to assert his presidential authority, because he comes up with his own plan for uniting the nation. This will be known as presidential reconstruction. Now, how does this work? Johnson's going to offer pardons to nearly all white Southerners. For my Paris, Texas students, he offers one pardon to General Maxey, that we know very well here in Paris, Texas. He grants him an actual pardon, and this is actually done through his friend Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Johnson will appoint all provisional governors, and they're going to call state conventions, and they can only elect whites. Under his plan, as long as the South admits that they got rid of slavery, denied the right of secession, refused to pay the Confederate war debt, they're pretty much in control of their own affairs. And so the South can be, these southern states that were in rebellion can be brought back into the United States. Now, how did Northerners feel about Johnson's plan? Most Northerners feel that Johnson's plan deserves a chance to work. Let's see how this thing actually plays out. However, what we're going to see is it turns most Republicans from the North against Johnson. And the question is why? Well, the thing about it was most white voters in the South returned those Confederate officials who had once held power back into power. And also what the North is hearing is also reports of violence coming in from the South against these former slaves. So it's pretty obvious that the South has learned nothing out of this Civil War. And as you can see in the cartoon here on the left, Johnson is a magician doing the ring trick, trying to bring the two rings back together. And as you can see, it's labeled both North and South. Now, what is the great opposition in the North against Johnson's plan? Well, like I said, it was obvious that the South had not learned anything. And what the South puts into place, these various southern states, are something called black codes. These were laws passed by these new southern governments that regulated the lives of these former slaves. It granted them certain rights that, yes, they were free, they could own property, but one of the things that they couldn't do was serve on juries, testify against whites, serve in militias, or vote. And also what it set up was that former slaves would have to sign yearly labor contracts with former employers or finding an employer. And what this meant was that if these former slaves did not sign these labor contracts, they could be arrested and forced to work on these plantations. Now, in December 1865, Congress, the 39th Congress, comes back and they learn of Johnson's plan. They're horrified that Johnson hasn't consulted them about this, that this has happened kind of behind their back. And, you know, again, they're greatly horrified that Johnson announces that Reconstruction is over, the South's been brought back. Now, radical Republicans, like I said, and we'll kind of talk more about them, they're kind of demanding more harsher treatment for the South. We went through 4 years of this great bloodshed. The South, again, has not learned anything. They're going to have to be punished. So these radical Republicans call for the dismissal of all these Southern governments, and they want Confederates excluded from power. One of the things is, under Johnson's plan, when these former Confederate officials are voted back into power, into Congress, into the Senate, these radical Republicans block the door to where these Southern senators and congressmen can't actually take part in Congress. One of the things that the radicals want is they want black men to be guaranteed the right to vote. A lot of these radicals come from New England. Others are from rural areas in the North. And the thing about it is, from this war, they see that ultimately equal rights have to be given to all men, that this issue of slavery was an issue that had to be dealt with, and that we just couldn't ignore the issue. What these radical Republicans also want is an expansion of federal authority, the federal government. As you remember in our lectures from last semester, we talked about how most Americans regarded, a powerful government as a threat to their liberty. That is slowly kind of changing, and these radical Republicans believe that if anything's going to get done, it's going to have to require a large expansion of federal power. Now, federalism and states' rights can't stop the effort to protect all citizens, these radicals say. Now, the man on the left, Thaddeus Stephenson from Pennsylvania, was the leader of these radical Republicans. He had actually had been a blacksmith, had actually employed both black and whites, had paid blacks equally. And Charles Sumner was from Massachusetts. He was kind of the co-leader of these radical Republicans. And basically what they saw during the war is they wanted these former slaves freed, and they wanted to provide them with arms during the war to help fight this war. And with the war over, they wanted black suffrage in the South for these people. Another thing that Stevens wants to do to punish the South is to take land from these large plantation owners that had been disloyal against the United States, break up these vast kind of plantation estates, and give out parcels of land to the former slaves. Now, by 1866, two bills had actually been proposed by moderates, not the radicals. And they're looking at Johnson's plan and they think, Johnson's plan, it just needs to be fixed here and there. One of the things that these moderates want to do is extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was an organization set up during the war to help provide for these former slaves, to provide them with food, clothing, with some education. You have to remember, here was a group of people held in bondage with little education. Some of them didn't know what was down the next road, and the question was, how were you going to now provide for these people once they were no longer slaves? The second part of the bills proposed by these moderates was the Civil Rights Bill. Basically, what this says is that all persons born in the U.S. are citizens, and it spelled out exactly what rights citizens could enjoy regardless of their race. So the centerpiece of the bill is equality before law. But the sad thing about it is the bill made no mention about the right to vote. And what we saw was this was really the first attempt in U.S. history to define what the essence of freedom was in the United States. Johnson, looking at this, vetoes both bills. His great hero is Andrew Jackson, whom he shared a home state with. And what we're going to see is Congress is going to pass bills, and Johnson, like his great hero Andrew Jackson, is going to veto them. Where up to this point, Andrew Jackson had had the most vetoes of any president of 12. Johnson is actually going to beat out his hero and hold it at 29 vetoes. So Johnson, like I said, vetoes both these bills, and what Johnson believes is this is unconstitutional, that this is centralizing power in the national government, and that authority should be given to the states to regulate their own affairs. So Johnson, what we're going to see is, and as we talked about, he holds very racist views. He's probably the most racist president that we've ever had. He says that, blacks didn't deserve the rights of citizenships. What in Johnson's mind he believes is that basically blacks should go back on the plantation and leave government and the kind of the political sphere of the nation to whites. So basically what this is going to do is set up a split between Johnson and the Republicans. So during this, Congress fails by one vote to override Johnson's veto on the Bureau. But the Civil Rights Law becomes law over Johnson's veto. So now the Civil Rights Law is now the law of the land, much to Johnson's annoyance. So, with this, Congress is drawing up its own plan for Reconstruction. And in June of that year, it approves the 14th Amendment. Now, what the 14th Amendment says is, it says that if you're born in this country, you are now a citizen of this country, and that states can't take away the privileges and immunities of a citizen, and it has to guarantee equal protection under the law. And so what this creates is this kind of broad language which will allow for the future meaning of the guarantee of equality in the United States. It's an amendment that actually is today hotly debated, especially with the issue of immigration into the United States, especially illegal immigration with children born here from illegal parents. And so this amendment can trace its way all the way back to trying to, like I said, define who is a citizen of the United States in the aftermath of the Civil War and slavery. The thing about it was, this 14th Amendment, it was a compromise, and it still doesn't guarantee blacks the right to vote. What we saw was that it said that if votes were denied to blacks, then Southern representation in Congress would be lessened. And what we saw was the amendment actually starts to produce divisions within the parties. No Democrat in the North votes for this thing. Radicals are very angry that black suffrage has not been granted by this 14th Amendment. And so this amendment, like I said, saying that those born in this country are now citizens, was the most important change to the Bill of Rights since its adoption when we talked about the creation of the Bill of Rights in the first semester. Now, this 14th Amendment is the central political issue in 1866. Johnson, to whip up support against this, conducts what are called around the circle campaign trips throughout the North. And what we see is he's trying to urge voters to elect congressmen who will support his plan. But what actually ends up happening is during his speeches, people in the North start to heckle Johnson. Johnson is somebody who really can't take criticism well, and he begins to heckle the crowd back. Someone who actually took with him to kind of lend authority to his message was Ulysses S. Grant, who was at the time one of the most popular men in the United States, having won the Civil War. And Johnson is very horrified by this, and he writes to his wife saying how embarrassing it was to watch this and how this was beneath the dignity of the presidency. But he begs his wife not to tell anybody because in public he's got to be seen to support the president. So ultimately Johnson undermines his own plan by kind of acting unpresidential and engaging in kind of, like I said, yelling matches with those who are heckling him. Also coming on the heels of this were reports of violence in Mississippi and New Orleans against freed people. So what we saw was these factors kind of combined in helping Republicans gain office who opposed Johnson. So Johnson's urging actually all southern states not to ratify this. All refused but his home state of Tennessee. And so what this does is it actually pushes moderate Republicans who were willing to work with Johnson into the arms of the radical Republicans. Now, what we see was in March of 1867, Congress will adopt its version of Reconstruction, known as Congressional Reconstruction. What was actually going to happen was the 10 southern states were going to be divided into 5 military districts. Tennessee was excluded because it had already been admitted into the Union. But the remaining 10 states would be divided into, like I said, 5 military districts. A Union general would be in charge of these areas. 20,000 troops would be stationed. And what we saw was they would be responsible for protecting the freed people in these states. Now, during times of election, it would also be up to the military to register these people and actually conduct elections. And once these states had actually approved of new constitutions, which approved of the 14th Amendment, then they could be readmitted into the United States. And this is actually going to be known as Radical Reconstruction. Many motives were behind Radical Reconstruction, as we saw. And what we saw was Johnson will veto this, saying that it's unconstitutional. And what this sets us up for is a conflict between Johnson and Congress that will ultimately weaken the power of the presidency for the next 30 years. So what exactly happens? In March of 1867, Congress attempts to bait Johnson into a trap with something called the Tenure of Office Act. What this said was that Johnson, as president, didn't have the power to remove any office holders without the Senate's approval. Johnson is willing to test this out. He sees it as a challenge, and he's going to meet these challenges head on. As I said, he's a very stubborn man. What Johnson does is he actually fires a holdover from Lincoln's cabinet, the Secretary of War, Edward Stanton. And once this is known, the Senate actually, he's actually impeached by the House of Representatives once this is known what he did to Secretary Stanton. And this is moved up to the Senate, where he will be placed on trial, again before the Senate. And he's on trial for violating the Constitution. And Johnson, when he hears this, is very shocked because he's seen his whole career as nothing but protecting the Constitution. And he thinks that they're actually acting against the Constitution. Now, the trial that follows, it's going to require an impeachment vote of a 2/3 majority vote, basically 36 out of 54. And during this trial, this was kind of like the social event of the year. It was kind of like the Super Bowl. These tickets, as you can see on the left, were actually scalped outside of the Senate. It was the big thing everybody wanted to be seen at. However, due to various reasons, Johnson escapes from being impeached by only one vote. So this is the first time in the history of the United States that a president is being impeached. And the one person who actually voted not to impeach Johnson had saw that things had gone too far, and he did not think that it was wise to impeach a president. Now, I want to say this. Not everybody was against Johnson, and radical Republicans at this time also experienced great unpopularity. Johnson did receive letters in the mail encouraging him to fight against what they saw as a great tragedy of justice. But Johnson, like I said, escapes impeachment by one vote. So Johnson survives, as this cartoon illustrates. There he is. He's depicted as kind of being a king. And as you can see, the scissors that are attached to him is a reminder of his kind of background as being a tailor. Now you're asking, why is he holding a bottle of liquor right there? That was going back to the second inauguration of Johnson and Abraham Lincoln. Before Abraham Lincoln gives his kind of seminal speech after the Gettysburg Address, or some say it's even better than the Gettysburg Address, Johnson actually gives his speech of acceptance as being president after being, or vice president after being sworn in. And the thing about it was, Johnson was getting over either typhoid or yellow fever, and to try to kind of lessen the effects, he had actually started drinking whiskey. And during the speech, he was so drunk he couldn't remember people's names, and it was just an embarrassment. And a lot of people there, it was just a kind of this cringe-worthy affair. And so he kind of was seen now as being depicted, I should say, as being drunk. And here is Edward Stanton right here, and he's fainted. And so Johnson has now survived, and he is still president. But the thing about it is, Johnson is very humbled, and after this he kind of goes along. The long-term effects about this impeachment of Johnson was that it's going to weaken the power of the presidency, where Congress now is taking more authority in the affairs of the nation, and now the president's kind of taking a back seat. So what we're going to see is, during this coming Gilded Age, it's going to be a series of presidents that don't do really anything remarkable. Most people really can't name them off the top of their heads. And this is going to change in 1901 with Theodore Roosevelt, and we'll talk more about that. So that's the end of the lecture, of the first part of the lecture of Chapter 16. So what we will see in the next part is ultimately how Reconstruction is ultimately going to fail in the South. So until next time, guys, this is History with Hens, and I'll see you later.